Hey guys, as you can tell, we're back to just a single person in a video. Life happens, you know. So I'm once again just kind of winging it, which brought up, while I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, winging it as a DM. In fact, last night when I was running the second part of what was supposed to be a one shot, ended up is going to be 3 parts. I left my notes at home. This is why you always back up your notes. I should have put them on Google instead they were in a text file. Put them on Google. First piece of advice, put them on Google in your Google Drive. That way you have constant access to them. It's a lesson I've learned. They're now in my Google Drive so that when I run the third part, whenever I do run it, they're available. But basically, I had to remember what I had planned out and then go from there. And improv, basically everything. So for the context of this one shot, I was doing an Elseworlds type game where characters came from other universes. They land in a town that I had no name for, that had no name before it, but people came to call it Hub because it's where all of the people from other universes came to rest. And they had to hunt down a person that had come to Hub, and find out how they had left, because they had been around for ages and then suddenly they weren't there. And it was not like they died, because this person was able to die. If you're familiar with the Soul series, it was the Tarnished from Elden Ring. They would die, go back to Hub, and then have to start all over again. So it wasn't like they died, because they just disappeared. The progression of the quest was that there was 2 paths, 2 locations that he was constantly trying to get to try and find a way back to his own world. One was this great tree that reminded him of the Erd tree, again, Elden Ring based lore, and another was a set of catacombs in the mountains. The party decided to go to the tree, which was an obvious setup with it being the Tarnished. I wanted them to go to the place that was most obvious first, so it would be the incorrect choice, but we would have a fun battle against 4 other multiversal entities, which they actually successfully talked their way out of. I didn't expect our normally murder hobo-y party to do. In fact, they've talked their way out, snuck their way past, or in any other way gotten past a lot of combats that should have happened. In fact, the last one I had set up and was in my brain primarily as the big combat for that night, and they just went past it. But the basis of it was, I had a whole bunch of notes that during these 2 paths, there was A, B, and C, random rolls for encounters, but that I had, characters built up and monsters and things. Did a lot of homebrew, as I usually do. If you're a follower of the show, you know I do a lot of homebrewing monsters and things from other universes for them to fight. And each path had its A, B, and C. The path to the tree, A was going through the plains, B was going through a section of the Feywild, and C was actually at the tree. For the path to the catacombs, we had A, which was the travel to the choke point. B was the choke point, which was supposed to be a big battle with an enemy that was boss level. Just to kind of reduce their resources. And then C was the catacombs, which is basically an old-fashioned dungeon maze undead focused type of encounter. So the problem being, I didn't have those notes either time when I was running. So I had to improvise basically everything, including finding applicable monster stat blocks to use and then just changing them up one way or another so that I could run these encounters with creatures that weren't from D&D. Let's see, I'm trying to remember. I remember they fought necromorphs in the first session. Necromorphs from Dead Space. They fought... that first session was almost a month ago, so I'm having trouble remembering, but a lot of it was finding stuff in the stat block, in the monster manual, and just going, okay, I can use that and change this to that, or give them this resistance. It'll bump up the CR, which has never been a problem, because the CR system is broken, as we've said before. When we play, our DM Doug, I'll have to go back and fix that. Loke, he uses an app that that you can put monsters in, and it assigns it based on CR level, and you choose the monster and it'll come up and say, hey, this is too dangerous of an encounter. It says that every time with him, and every time we get through combat with minimal use of resources. So it's a broken system. So my whole thing, I guess I'm going to try and organize my thoughts here because they're not, I'm just kind of shooting off the cuff. Improving for D&D does require some knowledge, some fairly deep knowledge of the game's mechanics, of how the CR system actually works, and how to build scenarios and role play on the fly. Like I said, there have been several opportunities where it should have been combat, and instead it wasn't. Take, for instance, the combat against the 4-member Elseworlds party that they came up against. We at the time, I think, had 5 or 6 members, so it should have been a slightly difficult fight, but it wasn't the boss fight as intended for the one-shot. That's all the way down in the catacombs, but of course the dice do what the dice do, and things turned out much longer in both scenarios than they should have. Which is another thing. Roll with the punches. If a one-shot turns into a 2-shot or a 3-shot, just roll with it. There are days where your forever DM is going to want to take a break. Go ahead and, let him do that and take over for a little bit and flex those improv skills. That fight against those 4 started out as combat, but Nigglewart was playing Gandalf, and he ended that combat by creating a wall of fire between our players and the other team, and basically harboring a truce. Because one of them had fallen, my players were still standing but had taken some damage, and we just wanted that, because we had the parties had the same goal, which was to get home. There wasn't really any animosity. I just offered them, there are these 4 badass looking people over there looking for the same thing you are. What are you going to do? And I just banked on murder hobo mentality. But again, roll with the punches. If your players come up with a fun way to end something, let them do it. This past one, with the boss fight that was completely skipped, I had left a couple of Elden Ring type messages out saying, hey, strong foe ahead, and giving them an idea of where he was without outright going, he's right there, don't... Well, I mean, kind of outright going, he's right there, don't mess with him. But I wanted to initiate the combat because this was supposed to be a big mid-level boss fight before going into the dungeon. And it was a Fallout character with T60 power armor. Not a very big health pool, but a lot of AC. And weapons that are, far beyond what they should have done. Basically, he had access to one Fat Man missile, which was a 9th level fireball, and a Gatling laser, which didn't do a lot of damage, only a D4 of damage per hit, but it got 16 attacks per round. Rolled off of, I had to roll each one, which with a dice rolling app is a lot easier than just rolling 16 D20. But it was intended to make them use some resources, maybe use some of their healing potions before they got into the dungeon. Not an impossible fight, and not even really that difficult, but would have been a fun encounter. Instead, what they did was Felix, who was playing Megumin from Konosuba, fired an explosion way up in the sky, caused him to look around, and then they all took off. Well, he has blind sight with his motion tracker, so he saw them running and turned and was about to fire, but they got so far up that instead he dropped the Gatling laser and pulled out the Fat Man and fired it, which did a fair amount of damage, but didn't even bring them down to half health. Because they're all level 12, and I set him to be about a level 16, 17, or CR 16, 17, maybe with how crazy high his AC was, about a level 20, and all his resistances. But it was all done on the fly. Basically, I took the Warlord stat block, just the strength and all that, and then came up with the abilities and what the Fat Man was, what the Gatling laser was, because all the notes that I had, I remembered some details, like there were 16 attacks. I didn't remember how much damage it did. So I was like, a D4 sounds fair. If you hit for all 16 attacks, that's 16 D4. That is not a small amount of damage, but hitting for all 16 attacks is a task, especially at level 12. And it's the coming up with stuff on the fly I tend to do a lot of in my campaigns. The Fallout campaign I have coming is a long endeavor in trying to break myself of that habit, but even then I can't help but love a little bit of chaos, a little bit of randomness, and having to improv on the fly. So I'm sure there's going to be stuff I'm going to make up as I go along. But with that being said, the ability to just roll with the punches and to pull something from nothing, I think, can be a learned skill. It's not something that you've got to be born with, per se. Really, it comes with knowledge and experience. I've been playing D&D a very long time, so I've been through a lot of scenarios, a lot of campaigns. I intake media all the time. That's a big thing. Don't be afraid of using outside material. Copyright doesn't exist at the D&D table, unless you're live streaming and you've got an audience of millions. Somebody's going to notice, somebody's going to get angry. But if it's just you and your buddies at your table, copyright doesn't exist. Throw a Fallout character with T60 armor. Throw Gojo at them. Almost impossible to hit. I have classes that I've made up homebrew that are based on Rocket League cars that I have thrown people up against in a 3v3 match where they had to not kill the other opponents but score on them with a big, large, well, basically a ball of metal that they had to smack around and try and get past these others. And that was a ton of fun. And it all comes up in the moment, more often than not, that what I had planned may not be as fun as what's going to happen. And that, I'll say it over and over and over again in this video. Roll with that feeling. Roll with that gut instinct. Roll with the punches. The changes that your players will come up with, the changes that you'll come up with, often can lead to moments that are far grander than anything you had planned ahead of time. The Felix, his first character in this one shot, 3-shot at this point, was Friar Tuck, but specifically the Friar Tuck from the animated Robin Hood movie from Disney, who had been around long enough to have become jaded and overly violent, overly reliant on drink. And man, he hit like a ton of bricks. But instead of nerfing him, I just let him do what he's going to do and then change up the way things happened. The same thing with Mega Man. Mega Man is entirely explosion magic, and I had already set aside that there was going to be some new mechanics on the path to the catacombs. There was going to be a bleed mechanic, a madness mechanic, and a frostbite mechanic. Again, inspired by different things. The bleed mechanic coming from the Souls series, the madness mechanic coming from the Call of Cthulhu series, and frostbite coming, I don't remember what the system is called, but it was one based on Norse mythology, where you take a level of exhaustion, you take more damage, it's harder to hit, that kind of thing. Bleed was you build up bleed, and then when you hit that limit, you take a whole lot of damage. And then madness, obviously, you kind of have to stop and you're gripped by madness and you lose your turn, that kind of thing. You lose your movement. All this I had planned out, but again, I didn't have my notes, so I had to kind of come up with, well, where does the bleed come from? In my notes, the bleed mechanic was taking your Constitution modifier, multiplying it by 3, and then adding your strength modifier. I just made it a flat strength plus your strength score plus your con score. And it worked fine. Nobody procced the bleed, but somebody did get very close. The madness, I actually got the same intelligence plus your wisdom. And then the frostbite was your Constitution modifier plus your Constitution score. I just said Constitution score times 2. Very close to what I had originally, but because I didn't have my notes with me, I had to come up with something on the fly, and it worked. It got them worried enough that, Nigglewart wanted cold weather gear to help avoid frostbite. Not how that works, but I gave him props for doing that. They were very careful about enemies that did psychic damage. They were worried about their bleed buildup, because if the bleed, went off, whatever their bleed score was, that was how much extra damage they took instantaneously. And then it starts to build back up after resetting. And all of these could be reset with a short rest. It's not like it was a continuous thing that they had to deal with. What I had forgotten is that in the notes I had potions of resistance, which I didn't offer them. I didn't offer as loot because I forgot they existed. That's the problem with working a full-time job and having a whole bunch of hobbies. You forget things. You just forget things. And then... Yeah, and then when rolling with the punches, one encounter we had early on was that I just flipped to I used the app and found a random stat block, and it was for a frost giant and an eagle. I'm like, well, why? And then I thought, okay, well, no, I can turn this into something. So they're walking along, and coming their way is a frost giant with an eagle on his shoulder. And they, instead of initiating combat, the giant, stoops down and says, "Hey, have you guys seen a big angry man with red hair and a big hammer?" Because when rolling I have them roll for weather each day, which has its own effects that they don't even know about. But it had rolled that it was very stormy and lightning and thunder and that kind of stuff. So I made it a frost giant running away from the storm, trying to get away from the wrath of Thor. Because this is a multiversal, type game. That is a definite possibility. And the Jotun, instead of being a frost giant, it was a Jotun, was afraid of Thor. So they just amicably told him, no, we haven't seen him. If we see him, we won't let him know where you're at. And the giant went his way, they went their other way. Because I played it more like a Jotun, where not necessarily willing to kill humans just because they're there. Not necessarily evil, more concerned with their own matters. So he was just trying to book it and get away from the storm. Another one had them sit down, and there was a possibility of somebody getting bleed because they found a cave. Well, it was actually more of a stone yurt set off to the side of the road so that they could rest. In the middle of the storm got worse, and it was basically a hurricane. And inside were Blade, Whistler, and what is her name? Because the original person I had written down here, it was Electra. I'm an idiot. It was Electra, but instead I made it plus size elf. If you know what plus size elf is, I see you're a man of culture as well. But Blade had been there for some time and didn't have access to his serum. So he was feeling the thirst. And if one of them didn't roll well enough in their watches during the night, Blade was going to try and feed. He was going to give in to the thirst and try and feed. Well, eventually, Megumin, who's on the last watch, rolls well enough to notice that he is tweaking. He is ready to go to town on somebody. And instead, offers up a solution, gives her own blood up voluntarily in a cup so that he doesn't have to bite her and maybe not unintentionally kill her, which satiates him. And then she offers him the advice, hey, don't be afraid to ask your friends to do this. I'm sure they'll be fine doing it as well. And as a DM, that's, you plan to go one way and maybe have it end in combat, and it's player comes up with an excellent solution. Just go with it. I may even have Blade show back up later in the catacombs. Guys, if you're watching this, don't take this to heart because I'm not sure yet. to give them a hand because of what Felix did. I'm using a lot of examples from this game, but that was because it was such a pull basically everything out of my ass moment. Another important thing, when you're doing this style of DMing, the very improv heavy, coming up with things on the fly, I was very thankful for the frequent breaks we took, which may have led to part of the problem with not being able to get to the catacombs to get things done, but it allowed me time to think of the next scenario, what I was doing, and what possibly could work. The general idea is to not be afraid of messing up as well. Not just rolling with it, but also not being afraid to mess up. Because if you give something that's too easy, hey, good job, you steamrolled this. It wasn't intended for you to, have all the problems that I probably intended when making the session. And then if it's too difficult, you can always back off, come up with a reason why they stopped fighting. The tiny things that you don't think about when you've got the rules and all your notes right in front of you become a problem, but I can't stress it enough. Just roll with it. They fought the Great Stone Dragon. If Mulan had gotten the Great Stone Dragon, it was a full-size Chinese dragon made out of stone, and it fired basically big old rocks out of its mouth instead of having a breath weapon. And it wasn't a dexterity save, as roll to hit, and it had an insane range, but didn't do too much damage. And then it also had its opening salvo, I came up with on the fly. It's up above the clouds and comes plummeting straight down, right at the party, and then just lands in between them all and has them do a dexterity saving throw as if he had done an earthquake or an earth shatter, and dealt some damage that way, or had them dodge, or whatever they did. And that was just kind of like a big cinematic moment that I came up with off the cuff. Of course, the fight didn't last long because Megumin is broken if you let her do what she's needing to do, which Felix has a tendency to make broken characters, but I was fine with it because this was intended, again, rolling with things, this is intended as a placeholder game, just to get us, give the forever DM of Alok time off, and to get us to the next campaign. So, it's, I don't know if I'm even being cohesive with what I'm trying to get across. So let me try and break it down into some bullet points. Number one, roll with it. It's so easy to get locked into this has to be a certain way. Don't let that take you over. Roll with it and just go with the flow. Rule of cool, if it applies at your table, should always take precedence when doing improv. Always. Second thing is know how to adapt, which sounds a lot like roll with it, but it's more of a, instead of incoming changes, outgoing changes. knowing how to take a stat block and go, okay, these are the parts that I need, and then taking other parts or just coming up with on the fly other numbers that you're going to need for this, for a combat, for an interaction, whatever. Next thing is, while you want to roll with it, have a sense of what you want your players to experience, not necessarily where you want them to go. I wanted this to be a, oh man, that's who that is type of game, where they recognize what they're up against and they feel excitement, dread, anything but ambivalence, really. I wanted them to feel something while fighting each one of these enemies or interacting with NPCs. They interacted with a stormtrooper, and it ended up with a funny interaction with one of the players who was playing Conan, who had never heard some of the terms and ended up just muttering space to himself over and over again. So getting that experience, I think, is what the most important thing of improving is. Knowing what the emotions, the intellectual resonance you want to give your players. And then the final thing is, if it feels like work, you're probably trying too hard. Stay loose. Stay quick to drop an idea if it doesn't work out. Especially if it's a combat that's not working. Or you can't force combat. I didn't do that with the T-60. Once they got out of range, he just kind of saluted them like, good job. You outplayed me. Go ahead. Enjoy it. So I think those are the 4 biggest bullet points I would have for improving as a DM. As a player, that's a lot of your, roleplay stuff. But as a DM, those 4 points should help you get through the challenges that you probably set against yourself, like I did. Well, anyway, hope I gave you guys something to think about, gave you some advice, hopefully didn't bore you. And in 2 weeks, we should be back with a full episode. I know I said that last time and it didn't work out, but hey, roll with it. See you guys.